little, kind of. Still working on my voice thing though. But I did get some sleep last night, which was like awesome. Props to my boy, Timmy T. Go Tim Tebow. Pardon me whilst I sip. Southern chicory coffee. Gotta love New Orleans. Okay, today what we're going to do in class is we're going to finish up here, hopefully, on Chapter 4, which is Basic Aerodynamics. One thing of note, at the end of the Basic Aerodynamics, we're going to have a quiz. I know. The quiz is going to be over Basic Aerodynamics and regulations. Okay, Basic Aerodynamics and regulations. Once we get to the airport operations chapter, that's where the human elements get kind of plugged in. There really isn't a chapter that correlates in the study guides to the first 3 chapters of the text, so that gets thrown into airport operations naturally. And so that's kind of when we'll cover that. So just remember that's where you're going to have to go to review for all of that good stuff. So just letting you know. Let's jump to it, shall we? So here, as we pick this up, and this is going to be figure 4-49er. This is page 117. We talk about wing flaps. Remember the reason why we have flaps. Sometimes, sometimes it's a good thing to give us a little extra lift. For instance, like when we're taking off. Slow flight, things like that, those are going to be areas where we want a little extra lift. Sometimes we want a little extra drag. Sometimes you feel like a nut, sometimes you don't. Well, you see, that's an old commercial. I don't know that that's even relevant anymore. It has to do with the Mounds bar and the Almond Joy. Peter Paul, that was the manufacturer of the Mounds and the Almond Joy bars. You can Google it. So, that's kind of why we have flaps. Remember what flaps do. Flaps sort of work here. I need to move my Tim Tebow. Hold on. Flaps elongate the camber of that wing to allow us extra lift to a degree. Once those shingles really start coming down low, then that drag that it creates is kind of a big deal. And so for slippery airplanes like Cirrus, even the Diamonds, slowing those airplanes down, that can be kind of a trick. Flaps can help us do it. Even in the stationair, it's, as big of a wing as that thing is and as big of an airplane as that sucker is, it's hard to slow that thing down. It's like when you lower the nose of that airplane and you got that big honking engine out there dragging everything downhill. It's kind of, requires a little thought as to how to start slowing that airplane down. So that's where flaps really come in handy. And again, landing as slow as practical, okay? So that's kind of the purpose of those wing flaps. You can look at those and the systems that are required here again. These are going to be again, just the review stuff that we have here. Lift drag ratios. These are going to be those areas here where, again, we really get into this in the commercial side of things when we do. You can look and just kind of see what they do is they use these numbers to try to figure out from a gliding standpoint what's going to be our better way to glide. For instance, if in the event of an engine out, and for that we don't use flaps. We keep the airplane clean. That's the most efficient way for us to go as far horizontally as we can while we're losing that altitude. But in some cases, when we're looking to land the airplane, then we can kind of start to see what is it that's possible here with regard to our flaps. In some cases, when you deploy the flaps, and I think most of you have flown enough to know that when you put those flaps in, you have that little, almost that sort of that immediate ballooning effect where you start to gain altitude. Normally what we do is that we want to apply a little forward pressure on the stick or the yoke to kind of not just resist that ballooning tendency, but by doing that, it also kind of acts as a little bit of an air brake to kind of help slow us down. And so that again can be a useful skill. We look at our pitch attitude. This goes back into the ballooning piece that we have, you know, when we're adding flaps and when we're not adding flaps. When you go out and you fly in slow flight and you start adding flaps and trying to maintain the same altitude, you know that your pitch angle is going to increase upward in order for you to fly slower at that same altitude. Leading edge devices, we don't have very many of those on small aircraft. Normally it's the bigger passenger, large passenger carrying aircraft. They're going to have these slats that they use, or slots in some cases, that is created by the use of those slats. And those things also can help delay the stall over the wing on the airfoil. So those are things that can be used to help us there in flight. Spoilers are a couple of things. In most cases, you're going to have what we call these things that deploy on a wing, and normally it is somewhere near the center of the wing is that you normally see these, and they're called speed brakes. And so you'll see these things that you can flip a switch and you can deploy these speed brakes. And sort of what happens is that you have these pieces of metal that when you flip that switch, it deploys a set of these metal panels that go flat into that wind. Some of them have slots in them just to kind of keep, you know, too much pressure from being put on those spoilers. But what that does, those speed brakes help us spoil the lift. It helps us slow down. A lot of gliders have spoilers on them, speed brakes. Some of the higher performance aircraft have speed brakes. The Seneca had speed brakes on it. So those are, you do start seeing those in some of the more high performance airplanes as a way to kind of start slowing things down. Commercial aircraft, you may see the spoilers actually when the airplane is actually landed, and that's going to work opposite the flaps. So in the trailing edge or the inboard sections of the wings, you'll see the flaps come down, you know, like this. Well, when they land, there's another section that kind of deploys this direction, and that helps spoil that lift, get that plane on the ground, making the braking action more efficient, keeping all the weight, you know, there on that runway. In addition to the reversers that they deploy there also to kind of slow that airplane down. So that's kind of how they do that. Thrust, we talk about that. This has to do with how are we using that power plant to create forward momentum. In this case, the illustration that we're showing is that you have some kind of an engine in there, presumably, that is turning something here that's got that little spinny thingy out there at the front end of that airplane. We'll call it a propeller. Remember that as something turns, that you're going to have other actions on this. Recall the four things that tend to turn a single engine propeller driven aircraft to the left. Torque is one of them. So when you look at the rotation of the propeller, understanding what happens, understanding the forward velocity created by the aircraft spinning, remember that the airplane propeller is a lot like a spinning wing. The shape of that propeller is the same. You have that sort of cambered element here at the front, this leading side of it, and on the back side of the propeller it's relatively flat. It operates in that same principle. A lot of people think it's just beating the air and just flogging it behind the airplane. Well, that happens to some degree, but it's not the total explanation as to why that airplane moves forward. It does so because of, just like with the wing, it creates that negative pressure in front, positive or higher pressure behind, and it sort of sucks itself forward. So that's kind of how that works. The helical motion of this propeller, we talk about the spin, how efficient that spin is going to be. Part of that has to do with with kind of the variable geometry that you may have on a particular propeller, whether it's fixed pitch, whether it's a constant speed, or variable pitched propeller. We notice that we do have changes here in the propeller from the hub out to the tip. Here at the hub, there's quite a bit of twist in this cross section here of the propeller, and there's not as much. It's relatively flat out at the tip. Remember why that happens? Because if it were the same pitch all the way through, you would have so much greater force being generated out here at the faster moving end of this propeller that these things would just explode. They can't withstand the differential pressure. And so you want the same amount of pressure being generated throughout the blade. Well, the way that you do that is you put a greater angle here closer to the hub, where this portion of the blade is moving slower than is the tip of the blade, which is going to be moving much faster. Some of these larger blades on some of these great big airplanes, some of the big radial engines that we had in World War II, etc. One of the reasons that at air shows you hear this, you know, as the airplanes come through, you hear this whoa kind of a thing going, you know, as the airplane goes through. Some people think that's exhaust. Well, it isn't. It's actually the noise of the propeller as that propeller is spinning supersonic, and so it's actually moving faster than the speed of sound, and so it creates a much greater noise there than does the exhaust of the aircraft. The forces acting on the propeller, you can look at this again. The propeller torque, this is one of the things that we talk about. Propeller efficiency, how efficient is this airplane, is this propeller moving through the air? Well, we know that at sea level the propeller is going to be more efficient because of the fact that it can dig into more molecules. We get up to 8,000 feet and taking off in Aspen, we know that everything is less efficient up there just because of the less dense atmosphere that we kind of start with. One of the things that I use is, like, you know, if you have a screw and you're trying to screw it into something, if you take a screw and you screw it into the drywall of your house, you're going to notice that with each rotation that screw disappears a commensurate amount with each spin of your rotation. Well, if you try to do the same thing with cotton candy, you'll notice that it's just going to slip. It's just not going to be as efficient. Same kind of thing happens with the less dense atmosphere that we have. Variable pitch propellers, these are going to be the things where we don't change the twist of the propeller, because that twist segment is going to be fixed. But what we can change is here at the hub of this propeller, we can change the actual pitch angle of the blade itself. So by doing that, we can create the more efficient blade angle for the various phases of flight. So what we want is that we want, you know, in takeoff, we want that fine pitch. And the reason that we want that fine pitch, or kind of that flatter blade on takeoff, is kind of remember that when we take off, we're not taking off. When we take off, we're taking off like this. Well, when we climb with that positive angle of attack, remember that the flatter blade presentation is relative to the pilot. But when you are taking off, now think about what that pitch, what that blade angle of the propeller looks like at your angle of attack as you're climbing out. Now you have a more efficient propeller here by it being a little flatter, because of the fact that your angle of attack has come up and now the presentation to the relative air has changed. So this makes it more efficient. Well, now when you level off in cruise, that flatter angle right there may not be as efficient. And so in this case, we may want to go ahead and take some of that pitch, take that fine pitch out and create a little bit more of a coarse pitch for cruise. Makes it easier on the engine, more efficient for everything. And so that's one of the reasons that we have that ability to do that, versus a fixed pitch. Fixed pitch, the twist of the blade, that's what you get. Now, remember, in some aircraft, like Cessna 172s or Cessna 1, I don't think 82s, because I'm pretty sure all of those are variable pitch. But I do know that in the Cessna 172s, at least they used to make 3 different blades that you could order for a Cessna 172. You could get a cruise blade, You could get a climb blade, or you could get the happy medium. So you could get a blade that actually went faster in cruise to pick up a couple of extra knots in cruise, and that's fine if you're like going places in a Cessna 172. If you needed to climb, for instance, if you're in Alaska, or if you're doing like, you know, bush work or something like that where you need to actually climb more, then you could get that kind of a blade, or you find the happy medium that just kind of gives you, you know, not too bad on the climb, not too bad on the cruise. You know, there you go. So that's kind of the way that you used to be able to do that. Cruise, approach, and landing. Also remember that we also go to a fine pitch before we land. One of the reasons that we do that is because, again, we're preparing for the go-around. Remember, it is a go-around checklist, not a pre-landing checklist, okay? Pre-go-around. It also helps slow us down. And you've noticed that when you're on short final, and in Aspen, we try to be good neighbors, and so what we don't do is we don't run with that high-pitched propeller any more than we absolutely have to. We use it when we need to climb, certainly, because we want to be safe, but we also want to be good neighbors. And so that's one of the reasons why, when we're in the traffic pattern and we're coming around and we're turning base to final, that final checklist is going to be that area where we make sure that we rotate that prop knob full forward to the full fine pitch, flatten that blade out, and you'll feel yourself getting pulled up forward into the straps as it kind of slows you down, which again, that's kind of a nice thing to be able to do, to slow down before you come in and see if you're going to be able to land or not. So there's that. The constant speed propeller controls, you can look at this, see what's going on. Left turning tendencies, remember what these are. The slipstream effect, this is that thing where the air circulates around the fuselage and it pushes against the left side. In a clockwise rotating propeller, it'll push against the left side of the vertical stabilizer, pushing the tail to the right, ergo the nose to the left. And so we counter that with right rudder. Propeller torque effect. This is going to be that thing. It's like when you have something that's spinning to the right, the natural thing is for everything else behind it to want to spin to the left. So that causes the thing to yaw to the left. Like real high-powered aircraft tail draggers are really susceptible to this, especially when the tail comes off the ground. So just kind of keep that in mind. The gyroscopic effect, this is another thing, is that where we kind of have to think in terms of you know, like that gyroscope, that rigidity in space, and also understanding the that any time that you put pressure on a spinning disc, the realization of that pressure will be realized 90 degrees downstream. So kind of what happens is that as that propeller is turning, and again, kind of picture that propeller turning clockwise, especially in a tail dragger, when that nose comes up, and that spinning disc is then moved this direction, then what happens is that you'll see that the airplane is wanting to kind of turn to that left, because as you apply that pressure kind of toward the top of that propeller, you get that effect here on the right side where it wants to kind of turn like this. That's what causes that nose to also want to go to the left, in addition to torque there as well. So you got a couple of those things kind of working against you. Then you have P factor. This is that asymmetrical blade. Just remember that, you know, when you pitch up, now you have the descending blade over here on the right side of to the pilot. That descending blade is actually going to get a bigger bite of air than the ascending blade over here on this other side. So as it gets a bigger bite of air, again, it wants to turn that front portion to the left, and again, we counter all of this with right rudder. So there, you know, there's the lesson. But just remember those 4 things. And here we are, there's the summary. Prevent unwanted yaw with rudder. Okay? So there's that. Now, as advertised, what we're going to do is that we're going to look here again at some of the more of the aerodynamics here, and I want to pop over here. Hang on. I don't know why in heaven's name. because this just started doing this, where it's getting kind of loosey-goosey. Okay, stability and control. Let's get here into stability and control. These are, again, some of the review stuff here for you. Static stability, dynamic stability. When we think about something that it wants to return back to a stable condition. So it's like if you have an aircraft, let's say the Diamond or any airplane, you know, like that is going to be more of a docile handling beast. Once you get it all trimmed out, what you want is a stability such that if you get an updraft, if you get a little draft from the side, the airplane will ultimately return to its pre-upset trim, where it'll kind of fly itself out of it and then get back to being stable. Okay, because what you don't want to do is you don't want something that then oscillates wildly and just continues to go out of control without some heroic input there on the controls. So that's one of the reasons why we talk about stability. Now, I say that, but the people like Sean D. Tucker, who go out there and they flog these airplanes around the air doing crazy stuff, it's like they want those things to be somewhat unstable. Well, somewhat, yes, unstable, because they couldn't do the maneuvers that they do without that instability. You can't take a 172 out there and do what Sean Tucker does in those airplanes. It's just not possible. So they do want that stability in there. Again, what's the mission? So know what the difference is between static stability here and dynamic stability. Okay? And so these are going to be the differences. Just review that. Okay? Stability and maneuverability, understanding the trade-off there. Airplane equilibrium. We know that an airplane is equilibrium in the four forces of flight when it is in level, unaccelerated flight. Okay? That's kind of what it is. Pitching moments. We're going to talk about this. Now, the pitching moment. You'll remember the axes of an aircraft. From the spinner to the tail, that's the longitudinal axis. Wingtip to wingtip, that's your horizontal axis or lateral axis. And then if you could balance your airplane from underneath on a pin, then this is going to be your vertical axis. So that thing that works up and down. When we talk about movement about the axis, if we think about the longitudinal axis of the aircraft, again, remember, spinner to tail, and we bank the aircraft and we move around that axis, that is movement about the axis. And with that, we're talking about bank. However, when we talk about the stability of that aircraft and the stability of that axis, we're talking about the stability of the axis itself. And so now, when we talk about movement around the longitudinal axis, we talk about bank. However, when we talk about the stability of that axis, remember we're talking about pitch. Okay, so it's that pitching moment, that stability of the axis itself. Movement around the horizontal axis, we call that pitch. But the stability of the axis itself is going to be bank. Okay? Remember that. So here we look at this, we look at the pitching moments of these things. We look at a traditional aircraft like a Cirrus here, and here we have like a Lake aircraft that has kind of that, the way the engine is mounted, the way that thrust is kind of working on that particular airplane, the way it was designed is that's kind of how it works. Horizontal stabilizer, keeping the thing balanced. Remember that the bottom portion of the horizontal stabilizer in most cases looks like an upside down wing, where you have the camber on the bottom of it, so that in essence it's like an upside down wing where you get that downward pressure that is created as you fly to kind of keep the tail level with the nose, if that's the way that you want that aircraft to behave. This is just what we talked about there. We talked about the angular movement here, about the 3 axes. We look at those. We look at this, bank, pitch, yaw. You'll remember all of that. Then we get into stability, longitudinal stability. This is where we get into pitch, okay? And again, this is just review for you, so nothing to worry about here. We know that our center of gravity, we remember that with regard to the longitudinal stability of that airplane, is that the way that the airplane is loaded is every bit as, if not more important than the amount of load that we put in that thing. We know that if you have a load, an airplane that is loaded where the CG is aft the CG limits, not only will that airplane be more difficult to fly, but it may not be able to recover from a stall should one occur. So keep that in mind. Forward CG, you're going to have more stability. Aft CG, less stability. Directional stability, here again, we look at that. We talk about yaw. Okay, you can read that. Lateral stability, this is going to be that thing where we talk here again. We look at the bank of the aircraft with regard to kind of that stability, because again, we're talking about the actual axis itself. Dihedral, understand, remember what dihedral is. Dihedral is different from the angle of incidence. Angle of incidence has to do with the chord line of how that aircraft wing is mounted to the fuselage from front to back. This is kind of as you look here from the inboard section to the outboard section. And we think, why do we have this increased angle or dihedral in these aircraft? Remember that low wing aircraft, you're going to have a more pronounced dihedral than in most high wing aircraft. Why is that? Well, if we think about this, we think about something that we refer to as the keel effect. When you have an airplane where the mass is slung below the wings, so here are your wings and here's the fuselage of this airplane. It's kind of like a big boat. When they build a ship, that great big piece of metal that they put at the bottom, basically from the bow to the stern, they lay the keel first, they build the boat around it. That keel is what keeps that airplane, keeps that boat, excuse me, or ship, keeps that kind of from becoming less stable in the water. That weight hanging down there tends to keep that ship stable. Same thing happens with an airplane. When you have the mass below the wings, the mass of that aircraft below the wings tends to have a stabilizing effect in the event of some kind of an upset of that aircraft. A high wing aircraft where you've got the mass is going to be sitting on top of those wings, it doesn't have the benefit of that mass hanging below it. So the engineers had to design a way for the wings themselves to act with a stabilizing fashion. And I know that this is exaggerated, it's just as far as I can bend my wrists. So it's like this on the wings. And again, the reason that that works is because as that airflow, as there is that upset on this, and I'm going to try to get the right picture of this, what happens is this downhill wing will create more lift than this uphill wing. When that happens, this wing will try to lift this wing up against the less lifting effect of this one over here. So that's kind of what happens there with the keel effect. Stability on the ground, just kind of remember how all of this stuff works here when your airplane is on the ground. And we're looking here now at the difference between tricycle gear airplanes, tail-wheeled aircraft, kind of this. what they call it, sort of the weathercocking tendency of an airplane. If you have a right quartering headwind like this, that wind tends to push here on the vertical stabilizer, pushing the tail to the left and the nose to the right. So again, we want to control or put our controls in an attempt to resist that. We do some of that with rudder, we do some of that with aileron when we're on the ground. We look at the control of the airplanes, the three primary control surfaces, elevator, aileron, and rudder. You know what all of those control. The secondary control surfaces are going to be flaps and trim. Okay, this is stuff that we have covered. This, the CG position, we understand that. This is the old Beech V-tail here. It doesn't have a vertical stabilizer, and in this case like this, it's got sort of that butterfly type of a tail on it here, and you sort of have a stabilator. It's sort of a horizontal stabilizer and a horizontal stabilizer and elevator all into one. That's what I was trying to say. Goodness. So you can see the difference here between a stabilator and a horizontal stabilizer with elevator. Ailerons, we know that that is for bank. We know that the ailerons also can be differential ailerons, so that in order to try to prevent some of the adverse yaw that can occur when you're starting a turn, is that you can see that in some cases you may have a right aileron that will come up higher than the lower aileron over here with this, and part of that has to do with reducing drag on the opposite side of the aileron. Different types of ailerons, freeze type ailerons, and they use this to sort of equalize the effect of the aileron going up versus the aileron coming down, and to kind of reduce that adverse yaw. Rudder. Rudder is rudder. And we know that we're using that to control yaw, the directional control of the aircraft. Control effectiveness, this is one thing to keep in mind, that the faster those molecules, that you're shoving that airplane into that air mass, and the faster that you're moving metal through molecules, the greater effectiveness you're going to have on your controls. One of the reasons that you want to remember that is because you are going to fly certain aircraft at some point that, in a landing configuration at a real low airspeed, the controls can be really kind of sloppy, and you have to be prepared for that, because you want to make sure that you have enough primary surface control to make sure that you can do what you want to with the airplane. The trim tabs here, we talk about these, the trim tabs, the anti-balance tabs. These are going to be things on here. Sometimes they'll put those tabs on there also. Some of the Cirrus have these trim tabs moving opposite the direction of the actual control surface in an attempt for the slipstream to help you move. We want to always trim the airplane, because in most cases the only trim that we have in most training aircraft is just going to be an elevator. But we want to try to trim out the effect of the pitch control things to sort of not really put the airplane in like an autopilot, but if we trim out those control pressures, especially in pitch there with the elevator, then it kind of frees up our mind, frees up our muscles to do other things around the cockpit, which can be useful. Mass balancing, sometimes they'll say that mass balancing here is just like when engineers give up and they just put a weight on something. I don't know what that is. Stability and control, that's the review of Chapter 5. Go us. Aerodynamics in flight. So here we have in straight and level, unaccelerated flight, All of these things are acting in what we refer to as equilibrium. The effective weight on a flight. Does a heavy airplane fly as fast as a light airplane? No, it doesn't. And when we look at this, these are going to be kind of the reasons why. With that heavier airplane, we're going to have a higher angle of attack even in cruise, and so therefore we're flying at a higher drag component than we might otherwise fly. The airplane's not going to fly as flat as a lighter airplane. In climbs, we're dragging an awful lot of mass up there, so again, climbs are going to suffer with a heavy airplane. Zoom climbs. Now, I do want to make a note here. Figure 6-5, this is not something that we do in the normal course of training. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. But this is one of those things where you kind of come downhill, build up some speed, and then kind of do just the little loop-de-loop-de, okay? Kind of a thing like that. So, but we don't do that in training aircraft. Steady climb, this is one of the things is that after you transition from either a takeoff roll or from cruise and you're climbing to a new altitude, you have that little transition area there where you make your transition from one phase to the next. Once you are established in that next phase, that's kind of when you can start doing the math on, the differential between what it's taking for this airplane to climb versus the forces that are acting against it. And that's what this is talking about right there. So here again, we talk about the different types of climb, Vx versus Vy. Vx is going to be best angle, Vy is going to be best rate. Vx is going to be that thing that is going to give us the greatest gain in altitude over a particular distance. And then we have the best rate of climb, which is going to give us the greatest gain in altitude over time. Cruise climb is kind of a compromise here. A Vy, it's not as high of an angle of attack, but a cruise climb is going to be something that, just to give you an idea, if your climb out from the airport is going to be at 85 knots, your cruise climb might be at 100 knots. So, you know, there's one there. I want you to look at figure 6-7 and do not think that this is exactly the way that the airplane looks when it's climbing out. This is just purely an example, and that's not how it works. We pitch for a particular airspeed. It's one of the first things that you're taught is you pitch for an airspeed, power for altitude. And the reason that we do that is because once you're able to fly those numbers, your life gets a lot less complicated and more predictable. So that's kind of what we look at. We look for a particular airspeed that gives us a particular rate of climb, like for instance, 500 feet a minute, 400 feet a minute, whatever that's going to be. Remember that in an instrument world, they expect you to climb at a minimum of 500 feet per minute. So whatever that airspeed number is to give you that 500 feet a minute, that's what they expect you to do in the instrument world. Performance charts that'll give you basic guidelines on how it all works. This is a good place to start. Then your experience with that airplane will kind of dictate exactly what numbers are going to work for you. All of these things, they are all given for brand new airplanes with a test pilot. So your numbers may vary slightly. You need to do some practice with yours to make sure that you know what you can do with that airplane and what you can't do. We talk about the winds. We always want to take off into the wind when at all possible, just to kind of help us get airborne earlier, makes things easier for the airplane in a lot of different respects, better performance. And so we have performance charts that we have in our AFM or POH that will help us to calculate what that type of performance we can expect at various altitudes and temperatures. So that's kind of what this is. Some aircraft are not as, well, all aircraft lose performance when you take off with a tailwind, and some of them are more susceptible to that than others. So just keep that in mind here with the wind. I'm going to keep going here on this because I want to finish this chapter so that then we can allow you to begin your study for the quiz. So descents, this is one of those things now where we want to let gravity be our friend, but we don't want it to be too friendly because otherwise we can wind up over the numbers of an airport going way too fast. So it's one of those things that we have to manage. We're kind of trading some of the types of energy for another. You know, we have that potential energy that we point the nose downhill, and now it can develop more of the kinetic energy. But we have to manage it to make sure that it's going to be, you know, useful for us. So we manage that with power before we lower the nose and flaps as necessary. So we think about that as we descend, unless of course we're beginning an approach, you know, way out, and the air is smooth, and you know, heck, you learn to fly an airplane to go fast. So let's just keep that ground speed up, as long as we're not going to run over anybody. Then yeah, you know, that's you know, why not? Factors affecting the glide angle. Remember that lift to drag ratio, that max LD ratio, that's that part that we want to look at for best glide. In the Diamond Heavy, it's 73 knots. As the airplane gets lighter, that number gets smaller. So with yourself only in the airplane and half tanks, your best drag number may be 70 knots. So that's kind of where that's going to be. Trying to fly that at a too high or too low of a number, that's what this is saying here. You think if you're going too slow, that may help extend your glide. Actually, it doesn't. What it does is it actually makes you descend faster. If you try to stretch that out and you say, okay, well, instead of 70 knots, I'm going to pitch down for 80 knots. Well, you're going to come in short. This is where understanding your numbers are so important, okay? Flaps, again, if we're in a glide situation, we do not want to use flaps until we are absolutely positive we're going to make that runway. And again, it talks about the differences in weight. A lighter aircraft is going to have a lower best glide number. Distance over the ground depends on the wind. Okay, and you can kind of see here sort of, you know, what's happening. The takeaway here is this. If you're gliding into a headwind, the distance that you're going to cover is going to be less. Okay, now again, remember that number, your glide number, has been established to keep you in the air as long as possible and to cover as much ground as long as possible as you descend. That headwind in here is going to affect that, so you're not going to make it as far. In a no wind scenario, then you can make all the math work. If you have a tailwind, this is where it's going to push you along even a little bit further. So in an engine out situation, you're trying to make an airport somewhere. In some cases, a tailwind may work to your advantage as opposed to trying to look at something perhaps a little bit shorter into a headwind. So just remember, it affects the actual distance that you're going to cover. It does not affect the rate of descent, okay? Remember that in the Diamond DA40s, the still air glide distance, we use a ratio of 13 to 1, okay? 13 to 1. Turning and load factor, we know that a level turn here, a coordinated level turn, is going to increase the load factor, meaning it's going to be asking these wings to carry more than just the weight of the aircraft and its occupants alone. So again, this gets into this type of a thing where we start talking about centripetal force pulling a body into that turn. It's the same type of a thing. Remember, what turns an aircraft is the horizontal component of lift, okay? This is where you get that centripetal force. We look at this, 45-degree bank, 60-degree bank. Remember that a 60-degree level bank, 60-degree level turn, I should say, is that you're asking that airplane to carry twice the amount of weight that is normally in that airplane, twice the mass. That's kind of how that works. This is where we get into the load factor, or G forces. So if you look here, here's 1G just kind of sitting there on the ramp. And we look here at 45, it's going to be about somewhere less than about 1.5. 60 is going to be double the amount of weight, and 10 more degrees, 70, is triple. So that's pretty stout. Remember that you've got those the charts that kind of talks about the bank angle. Okay, you need a little extra thrust to maintain your airspeed in a turn. It's why in your steep turns you roll in a little extra power before you start banking that aircraft and making the turns. Steep turns, this again is where we talk about this. This is where we add a little more power before we begin the maneuver. Stalls in a turn, remember what happens here to your stall speed. Your stall speed increases as your bank angle increases, okay, with this. Look at this. Your stall speed in a 60-degree bank angle is going to increase by 41%. It doubles here at 75 degree bank. So for instance, if your aircraft stalls at 52 knots, normally in that situation at a 70-degree bank angle, that's going to stall at 104 knots. So you got to be thinking about the airspeed if you're going to be out here doing this stuff. But remember the airplane that you're flying. Diamonds are not going to do that. Your rate of turn. Your rate of turn, this is that thing where is like how many degrees per second are we turning here? So if we think about this, standard rate is 3 degrees per second, meaning we can make a 180-degree turn in 1 minute. We can turn completely around in 2 minutes. So to make a full circle at standard rate will require 2 minutes. When does this come into play? Always in the instrument world. They expect you to make turns, course corrections, anything like that, standard rate. That's what they expect. But it also happens in the VFR world. Let's say that you're flying downwind and there's another problem with some kind of conflicting traffic inbound coming in from somewhere else. The tower at that airfield may ask you, they may say, 141 Hotel Lima, give me a right standard rate turn for spacing, please. So what they're doing is they're asking you here on the downwind to make a right turn, 360 degrees, standard rate. What have they just done? They've just bought themselves 2 minutes. So by you making that turn, terrain permitting, they bought 2 minutes to be able to do that. Okay? It also comes into play whenever you're making turns for holds. So the timing and the distance for the holds, remember that when you're making that racetrack pattern, you have, the one leg, when you're making your turn, that's 1 minute. And then you fly another 1 minute straight leg, and then a 1 minute turn and a 1 minute straight leg. Well, in this case, that's a 4 minute hold, right? So all of those things have to be done. Remember on the instrument side of the equation, planning, procedure, precision. You are going to be expected to be more precise in your flying. And it's one of the challenges, and it's one of the cool things about instrument work, is the fact that you're doing things a little bit better, hopefully. So we look at this and we think, okay, well, here we are. You can look at the bank angle necessary for the standard rate. Now, the one thing that you need to understand is that the faster you're going, the more ground you're going to cover. The radius of that turn is going to be greater. So you got to keep that in mind. Constant angle turn, constant radius turn. You can see what we're talking about here because again, just depending upon the increase in speed, even at the same bank angle, you're going to wind up covering a lot more ground. Where this comes into play is, are you having to make a 180-degree turn out of a box canyon? Do you want to do that at full cruise speed, or maybe do you want to slow down? Maybe you want to add a notch of flaps or two, stand that airplane up on a wing and get yourself out of there. Just saying. Stalls. Remember, the stall occurs at the critical angle of attack. See, it says so right there. That's what it says. This is what happens. Remember that the critical angle of attack in most airplanes, that they talk about that as like 16 degrees. I have seen some stuff where they talk about 14 degrees, but we're going to use 16 degrees. That's kind of what we're going to be using here for what we do. Recovery from the stall kind of depends on the event. If you're at full power and you're recovering from a stall, lower the nose. There you go. That's what you're going to do. Hopefully you have enough ground to be able to make that work for you. If you're in a power off stall, then again, you're going to lower the nose, wings level, full power. And that's what you're going to want to do. Okay? Factors affecting stall speed. You can read all of this. You've read it before. Load factor. Stall speed increases with load factor. However, remember, the stall occurs at the critical angle of attack, not at a particular airspeed. And airspeed does not define the stalling, okay? It depends on what you're doing with that airplane at the time. Just like we talked about in these steep banks, that your stall speed is going to increase because your angle of attack has increased. So just remember, that's kind of what happens there. And there's all of those. I looked at those before. Stall speed increases with rate. The stall angle of attack stays the same. The difference is that in a heavy airplane, remember, you're going to probably have to have more pitch, more nose-up pitch to hold that airplane level. Well, you're already predisposed 4 to 6 degrees toward that critical angle of attack just right here in cruise. So, you know, some kind of a big upset like that, you know, where you get a big pitch angle change, that may predispose you to reaching that stall speed quicker. Just like that. And power, we talked about that. Okay. One thing that they bring on here, power on stalls may be more definite and accompanied by a wing drop. This is one of those things, this is why you go out and you practice these maneuvers out there with an instructor, is because you see what is your airplane prone to do. I have been in some airplanes that in a power on stall that I pull that up, keeping those wings level is hard because it really wants to drop off from one side to the other. And in some aircraft, it's just as docile as you please. I remember flying the test flight on the Stationair, and we are at 38 knots, full flaps, 38 knots, holding 11,000 feet, and I'm climbing not climbing, but my pitch attitude is just like this, and I'm not losing anything. And this is well below the actual stall speed for full flaps of that airplane, but it was just sitting here just like that. The wings didn't drop. I was shocked. Ice and frost, we know that can increase stall speed. We don't know how much because, again, we don't fly airplanes with frost or other wing contamination. We just don't do it. So that's going to be a thing that you do. Flaps reduce the stall speed. So by adding flaps, we add more camber. That creates a little bit more lift. You get a different number. You get an airspeed lower now, all things being equal, where the aircraft will stall, which is, you know, it's a good thing. That's kind of what you want. That's why you fly an airplane slow when you land. So here's the, I don't want to say it's a typical, but it's an example of stall speeds in different situations that you might find in an AFM or a POH. So just kind of understand these and take a look at the relationships between clean and dirty. Okay, stall warning devices, you're going to have a little horn or a buzzer that's going to go off when you reach the stall speed. Stalling characteristics, normally what happens is that the aircraft will stall at the wing root first, and then that stall can move progressively outward toward the tip. That's the way it's normally designed. Not all aircraft do that, but almost all stable aircraft will do that, because what you want is you still want to be able to work the ailerons with the airplane in that slower flight position. The spin. In order to enter a spin, an aircraft first must be stalled. So just remember that. Big test question there. And what we don't want to do is that we don't want to let that stall progress to a spin. It used to be back in the day we would actually practice spin recovery. Now what we practice is we practice stall recovery and spin awareness. So this is kind of the thing here where it kind of describes the flight path of a spin. This is one of the things here where you get that wing tends to drop. That wing dropping and that nose pointing to the deck, this is kind of where you get that incipient portion of this spin. This is when the spin gets fully developed, and then you enter into this recovery stage here as well. The big thing that we do is we talk about stall recovery and spin awareness, but we also need to know the theory behind recovering from a spin. So with this, the first thing that you're going to do to recover from a spin is that you're going to want to make sure that you pull your power to idle. There's no sense of rocketing down to terra firma. Then we're going to determine which way is the aircraft spinning. Is it spinning left or is it spinning to the right? It will depend on which wing has dropped off. So if the wing has dropped off to the right, the aircraft is spinning to the right, we want opposite rudder. So we would apply the left rudder. Then, as we stop that spin, now we're pointed down. The Earth has stopped spinning, but we're seeing a lot of it. Now then, we notice our airspeed. We should have enough molecules that are now flowing over the wings to then begin a gentle pull back on the controls to level the aircraft. As we do that, we do it gently. We don't just yank back on the controls. Trying to yank back on the yoke or the stick in that situation can ultimately lead to a secondary stall and therefore spin. We don't want to do that. You may not have enough altitude to be able to recover from that second one, okay? So you want to be gentle with the controls. And again, these things are all like, you know, crazy adrenaline type of things, and we all know what our natural instincts are. The natural instinct is like, if something scares us, what do? You know, we do this. And what you see in airplanes is that for whatever reason, if people get scared in an airplane, what do? They yank back, you know? It's like, okay, don't do that, because that can be really bad. So with that, you have to keep your wits about you. Understand, okay, reduce power, pull it all the way back to idle. You're going to opposite rudder to stop the spin. Now you're going to gently apply some back pressure to bring that airplane out of it. Notice your airspeed here right now. Now with your wings level and you do have airspeed, we're going to start adding that power back in, and we're going to fly ourselves out of the situation, and we're going to say, we're never going to do that again. Okay, that's what you're going to do. Okay, there's that. Takeoff performance. We've talked about this. You have done this. Ground roll, etc. Weight, increased takeoff speed. We know that a heavy airplane is going to require a greater ground roll here, as would a light aircraft. Air density, like we talked about before with the propeller, we have to know that an airplane is going to perform better at sea level than it is in Aspen because of just the density factor of the air. So we look at that again. That much we know. We want to take off into the wind, avoid tailwinds. Crosswind components, we need to know how to use our little angled crosswind component calculator here to do this. You can go back and you can look at the examples here and refresh your memory here on the crosswind components. Remember, we're measuring the angular difference between the wind and the runway. Also remember that if you're looking at a wind that has been given to you in writing, is that it's going to be in true. Whereas if you get the ATIS or you hear from the tower, they're reporting the winds as magnetic. If it's written, it's true. If it's spoken, it's magnetic. You're going to have to remember to make that angular correction there on your, the magnetic variation piece for your particular airport and your location to figure out the exact magnetic angular difference that you need for takeoff or landing. Runway surface, you know, nice hard runway, that's kind of what you're after. If it's grass, that's one thing. If it's wet grass, it's another. If it's long wet grass, it's something entirely different. We use a notch of flaps to help us get off the ground a little bit quicker there as well. Just kind of depends on the surface, kind of depends on what it is that we're doing. And again, we're using this performance stuff here in just kind of general terms. We will look at the actual performance charts a little bit later on. The slope of the runway, that's going to affect us also. You know, downslope, gravity is our friend. We get rolling a little bit quicker, up and out we go. If we're having to take off going uphill, clearly our takeoff roll is going to be longer. And there's that, the takeoff distance tables, they will look at that. We look at those later on. This is like a table that they use versus a graph. This is one of those things that you'll find in the POH or the AFM. Landing performance, well, it's kind of opposite the takeoff, almost. So if we look at this here again, we have to understand what it is that we're doing. You know, a heavier airplane is going to need a longer runway because it's going to be harder to slow all that down. It's called inertia. Okay. So there's part of that. Again, the air density is going to be another thing because to actually create the type of indicated airflow over there, if there aren't as many molecules and they are further and farther between, your ground speed is going to have to be greater, clearly, to be able to create that molecular flow necessary to keep your airplane in the air. So just remember that it's going to require a longer runway the higher you go, and that your ground speed is going to also be higher. The effect of the wind, we've talked about that also, and I love this one. Figure 6-56. Here's your tailwind. Oops! Runway surfaces, you got to know what they are when you're landing. Clearly, a wet runway, it's going to be harder to stop. A snow-packed runway is going to be harder to stop. A good friend of mine, Chap Ramsey in Dallas, let me fly the Falcon 50 simulator in Dallas when I was there a couple weeks ago. And one of the last things that he did is he was throwing the kitchen sink at me is he had me aboard a takeoff at Teterboro on an icy and snow-packed runway. And it was really kind of crazy. I had full power as I'm jetting down the runway, and then somewhere at about 2,000 feet into the roll, he yells, "Abort." So again, I'm off the power, you know, reverse thrusters, hard on the brakes, and I slid a little bit more than 5,000 feet down the runway before I could get stopped. I used almost all of it to get stopped. So it was kind of a nutty deal. Hydroplaning, this is a thing where the actual tires, the rubber portion, where they don't make contact with the actual surface of the runway itself or the road if you're in a car, because it has that little barrier of water underneath it that kind of lifts the airplane, in this particular case, off the runway, and so that can that'll get your attention. Remember the slope, how that works for you. Just like the downward slope helps you when you're taking off, it hurts you when you're landing. Flaps, understand the benefit of the flaps. Fast approach speeds, that's just bad on everything. Hard on your equipment. It's different. The one place where a couple of extra knots on your approach and perhaps fewer flaps, if any, can be in a crosswind type of a scenario, because again, remember what we talked about before is that with that lower airspeed and the fewer molecular flow over those primary control surfaces will lead to some control issues if you're not real careful. So in some cases, if I'm landing in a big stiff crosswind, I'm not going to bring in as many flaps, and I may have a couple of extra knots on my airspeed so that I can control my kick and crab. Normally when I'm coming in, let's just say that I have a crosswind coming here from this direction. My nose is going to be canted somewhat into that wind as I'm trying to maintain my center line on the way down, understanding that the closer that I get to the ground, in most cases that wind is going to subside somewhat, but not all the way. So as I'm coming in like this, then I get over the runway and I begin my round out, which is that difference between your approach and then kind of flying parallel over the runway, which is where you bleed off whatever energy you brought with you on this thing. In this case, I'm coming in here on my approach, beginning my round out. As I begin my round out and as the aircraft starts to settle, I take from my crab and I kick opposite rudder, so I'm going to pull left rudder to pull my nose around while simultaneously lowering my right wing. My goal is that with that crosswind here is to land this wing down on my right main, and then as the energy kind of releases, again maintaining directional control with rudder, as that releases, then you want that airplane to kind of level out. When it does, expect a little runway action there with rudder, and then keeping that right aileron up into that wind just for other control. So there you go. Landing distance tables, we have those just like we do for the takeoff tables. In this case, it is a table versus a graph like we use with the FAA. There's that. Headwind component correction, we talk about that again. Wet and dry grass, yeehaw. Wake turbulence. The wake turbulence part of this, we know that wake turbulence can be deadly, and it is a thing that we always have to be conscious of anytime that we're operating near big airplanes, because we know that an airplane that is slow, clean, and heavy is going to be producing the greatest amount of turbulence. When does that condition exist? It's when they are taking off. They've taken off, useful runway is gone, gear up, flaps up. Now they're at full power, high angle of attack, they're going slow, they're climbing, creating the greatest amount of turbulence. It's not to suggest that following an airplane in trail cannot also be hazardous, because it can. You want to make sure that you have the right spacing behind that aircraft and you are at or above its descent angle on the way in, because coming in below it can also be a problem. That happened with a Bonanza owner. I think it was a Bonanza or a Baron. I can't remember which one it was. It was some B word that flew under a 737 somewhere and got into the wake turbulence like that, and it had a mid-air breakup, and it actually structurally destroyed the airplane in the air, just the turbulence part of it, and it was very sad. We also know that on takeoff, I think it was November of 2001, and that is when in New York, and I don't recall which airport it was, there was an Airbus that flew into the wake turbulence of a departing 747. And when it did, the co-pilot, flying on the right side, the pilot flying, tried to stabilize it with rudder, and he was kind of sawing back and forth on the rudders, evidently. It ripped the vertical stabilizer off the airplane, and sadly the airplane, as it began to descend, broke up in air and scattered out over Queens, killed everybody on board and several people on the ground. So it's a real thing. We want to be careful with wake turbulence. So here's your review. You can look at this. You have to kind of think about wake turbulence as having mass. You have to kind of think of it in those terms, because again, the turbulence is going to sink and it's going to spread out. So here, avoiding the wake turbulence in takeoff, you want to get airborne before the point at which the heavy iron got airborne and turn away. Okay, that's kind of what you're wanting to do. It shows you these things in these illustrations here when it's not really acceptable to take off on a crossing runway here when you might ask for additional time for the vortices to dissipate. In the traffic pattern, this, as I mentioned before, this is going to be tough, here, and this is not something that you want to find yourself in here. Approach to landing, yeah, beware the Concorde. We don't have to be aware of it anymore as it's retired. When we're landing, we want to land beyond the point at which the aircraft touched down. We know that when the aircraft touches down, it's no longer creating lift. When it's not creating lift, it's not creating vortices. So, just remember that part. I'm going to move this here. A go-around. If that big, heavy aircraft in front of you has gone around, it's probably a pretty good idea for you to go around. Just saying. Like right here. Jet blast. You can Google this, but you can see there's one, I forget, I've seen so many of these silly things. It's like a truck, and I don't know if it was staged, I don't know what the deal was, but it drives behind a 747 as it just applied full power for takeoff, and it blows this truck down through the jet blast area of here, just like a piece of paper. It was just kind of nutty. So you want to be careful of that. Helicopter rotor downwash can produce the same types of the vortices that an aircraft can, and it can be a big deal. There was a thing here in Colorado, in fact, where a Cirrus landing after a Black Hawk took off at an airport within about 30 to 40 seconds after the Black Hawk took off, and it flipped the airplane just over the runway. Guy walked out of his airplane, but the airplane was destroyed. And so go Cirrus. That's pretty cool. Ground effect. You want to see what ground effect is? Take a sheet of paper, kind of drop it with a little forward momentum on a table and watch how far it slides. The reason it does is because it does so on that little cushion of air. Same thing can happen from the downwash of an aircraft when it is close to the ground. How close? Within one wingspan width of the ground is the FAA rule there. So in that ground effect, you have less drag. So the airplane is moving without the impediment of the drag, and it can float. I've told the story about one thing that I did is just kind of a little experiment one day in New Mexico with the Diamond DA-40. And I came in hot. I came in over the numbers at 105 knots. And by the time that I went the entire length of it was just over a 5,000 foot runway, 17 and 3.5 there at Double Eagle Airport, I was still too fast to land and I went around. I floated the entire length of the runway. It was that's just how much energy that can happen, when you're coming in fast. It's why we slow down when we're going to land. We have to manage the energy of our craft. So here again, in energy management, we want to make sure that when we come over the numbers or we come down the glide slope here for a landing, and we're pointed at those 1,000-foot markers, that we are going to be able to land in the first third of the runway. And in order to do that, we have to be on our numbers. So that's kind of why we need to manage that. And the effect on landing and takeoff, and you can look at all of that. Wind shear. Wind shear is one of those things that can happen anytime, anywhere, in any condition. Clearly, there are other times when we might expect to see wind shear. Wind shear is going to be that sudden change of not just velocity, but direction of the air. It can be a complete cross like this. It can be at an angle. It can be up and down. It can be any which way. It's hard to tell, in this atmosphere where our weather is in a blender, where it's coming from. So as we look at this, you have low-level wind shear, which is 3,000 feet AGL or lower. The effects of wind shear on an airplane, it can basically just take the wind completely out of your sails, if you will pardon my nautical definition there. And we kind of have to watch how that works. This is why we constantly, anytime when we are in a small airplane and we are 500 feet AGL or less, we always have our hand on the throttle. Always. You're constantly having to make adjustments. And when you're operating in an area where there may be wind shear, then you're definitely planning on having to make those adjustments because you just never know. So the undershoot overshoot effect, you can look at this and again understand what that means when that greater wind velocity hits you. And again, the wind shear that we're looking at here is this. It's not a directional standpoint. It's just a change in the velocity. And so that's, you know, another thing that can happen. It's not necessarily a quick change of direction. It's just a drastic change in velocity. Downdrafts, updrafts, undershoot, overshoot, you can look at it. Wind shear reversal, this will get your attention. This is one of those things where when you're looking at this and you get the ATIS for a runway on an instrument approach and you're looking at something and they're saying, you know, like for instance, let's just say that we're landing to the east, you know, winds 09 or 0 at 10. Okay, well, I'm going to be landing here, you know, runway 9, perfect. You know, I've got a 10 knot headwind. But here you are at 1,000 feet AGL and you notice that you've got a tailwind. And you're thinking, well, what the heck? You're sitting there and you're looking at this and you're going, I thought they said it was a headwind. Am I landing on the right runway? Am I going the right direction? Am I blah, blah, blah? And you start thinking about all these things. And then all of a sudden it occurs to you, could it be wind shear? Well, then about that time, as you're descending down to about 750 feet, now all of a sudden things get a little crazy. And the power setting that you were just so fat and happy with before, now all of a sudden is all messed up and you're having to make those adjustments. But you had your hand on the throttle. So, this is why we do it. Guys, you just never know. I mean, this is just the way it works. Crosswind effect. We also know that the winds aloft are normally going to be greater than the winds on the ground. So as I mentioned before in kind of my crab and kick technique whenever I'm doing crosswind landings, is that I can expect, you know, at 1,000 feet those winds to be a little bit stronger. So my wind correction angle is going to have to be more pronounced. The closer I get to the ground, more of that I can straighten out of it, perhaps if the wind allows. Causes of wind shear. It can be anything. It can be storm related, it can be orographic, it can be, you know, a lot of different things. There it is, Chapter 6, Aerodynamics of Flight. So now, that gives us the 3 chapters of aerodynamics and the regulations. So, here's the quiz. If you go to Big Blue, and I'm doing this by memory, I believe that the first chapter has to do with aerodynamics. So all of that is going to be covered. Then, Chapter 4 in Big Blue, I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Whatever the regulations piece is there in Big Blue, that's what we're going to be looking for. So that is what you're going to study. Study those out of Big Blue. You can also use prepware onto the same things. All the questions in aerodynamics, all the questions in regulations. And that's what our quiz is going to be on, okay? So prepare for that for Friday. That's what that first quiz is going to be. Remember, the pace on this is going to be quick. It has to be. But again, all of this should be review. Well, I know it's review, okay? So there you go. Have an awesome day, and I will look forward to seeing you on Friday. And stop the broadcast. Yes. And